Why in the hell would the United States Congress mandate more cooperation with the government of Israel at a time we cannot even get accountability and justice for 9 American citizens who had been killed by Israeli settlers or security forces in the occupied? And I will discuss our work on that and other matters at another time. On the matter before us today, I'm sure we would disagree. Madam President, I rise in strong opposition to the Fiscal Year 2027 National Defense Authorization Act as it is currently written. This bill lays the groundwork for a bloated Pentagon budget that would further embolden President Trump's reckless and illegal war against Iran. It represents a huge increase in taxpayer-funded and debt-financed Pentagon spending at a time when families across the country are struggling to afford groceries, rent, gas, and other necessities. And this bill authorizes this whopping increase in funds for the U.S. military, despite the fact that the Department of Defense has never, and I mean never, passed a clean audit. And when we dig deeper into the bill, there are several other new significant provisions that haven't gotten much attention, but they should. One of them, Madam President, would mandate the establishment of a new United States-Israel Defense Technology Cooperation Initiative. It's a provision which essentially orders the President, orders the executive branch to expand our technology sharing and defense cooperation with the government of Israel. The other new provision would mandate that the President expand and enhance intelligence sharing with the government of Israel, and at the same time constrain the President's ability to limit such intelligence sharing with the government of Israel. Now, I want my colleagues to think about that for a minute. Even when the government of Israel may be taking actions that are inconsistent with our interests or values, whether that's now or sometime in the future, this provision requires that the U.S. government share intelligence information with them. Now, why in the hell would the United States Congress mandate more cooperation with the government of Israel at a time we cannot even get accountability and justice for 9 American citizens who had been killed by Israeli settlers or security forces in the occupied West Bank over the last 4 years? We've been seeking accountability in these killings year after year. No results. And why would we mandate this cooperation intelligence sharing when a 20-year-old American citizen student, Sama Safi, is being imprisoned by the Israeli government on trumped-up political charges as we speak, as we gather here? She has spoken about the abusive conditions she's faced during that imprisonment. And why would we mandate greater engagement with the government of Israel while the Israeli Minister of Defense, Katz, boasts about leveling 90% of the homes in southern Lebanon and says the plan is to do in southern Lebanon what Israeli forces did with American weapons in Rafah, which is a city in southern Gaza that was reduced to rubble? And why would we mandate this increased cooperation in defense and intelligence sharing at a time when violent settlers are running rampant on the West Bank, destroying Palestinian lands, pushing people off of their land, and often with the complicity of the IDF? Why would we be doing these things? The Senate should fully debate and vote on these new proposals before we mandate such major changes in policy. In other words, we, the Senate, should demand transparency and accountability from ourselves, from senators. Let's debate and vote on these provisions and see where senators stand. And these provisions are just part of the problem with this deeply flawed bill. This bill allows the Pentagon and military contractors to gorge at taxpayer expense, at the expense of my constituents and people all over this country. This bill would authorize a $1.15 trillion national defense budget, which is an almost 30% increase from the fiscal year 26 enacted level. In other words, the current level of funding. And President Trump is calling for even more. This authorization would increase that funding over current balances by $500 billion. But as we speak, the House is talking about moving forward with another $350 billion as part of another reconciliation bill. And then on top of that, Madam President, the Trump administration is asking for another $87 billion in supplemental funding to pay for their disastrous war against Iran. And let's not forget that the Pentagon got an additional plus-up of $152 billion from President Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill, which was beautiful if you were a billionaire, but not for anybody else, back in 2025. If Congress were to appropriate all of these funds, it would exceed $1.7 trillion, paid for by American taxpayers and financed on our national credit card, again, ultimately paid for by our taxpayers. So how can we possibly move forward with this huge expansion of taxpayer funds for the Pentagon's adventures overseas when the American people are struggling right now, paycheck to paycheck, here at home? I talk to my constituents. I know my colleagues do too. Our fellow Americans are fed up, and rightly so, with inflation, with the high costs of groceries, exploding healthcare costs, rising housing prices, and huge electric bills as we see more and more data centers being built. And as Americans suffer amid an affordability crisis, this bill, the bill that will be voted on tomorrow in terms of cloture, on the motion to proceed, would instead authorize wasteful spending for things like what? Like the president's so-called Golden Dome, which the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, found could cost $1.2 trillion over 20 years, as well as a list of other very costly projects. On top of that, as I said, the Pentagon consistently fails to pass an audit. In fact, just last December, it again failed to pass an audit. And so into this organization that can't pass an audit, the bill that we will be moving on would add trillions of dollars into that system that can't account for the money that it already has. Madam President, we would not tolerate such a lack of transparency and good governance in any other federal agency. And yet this bill rewards those failings at the Pentagon instead of fixing them. Fiscal mismanagement at the Department of Defense is a longstanding problem, but the Trump administration has made things worse. President Trump and his family have engaged with the Defense Department in ways that raise serious questions about self-dealing and misuse of public office. We have seen this administration repeatedly award major Defense Department contracts to companies soon after those companies established ties with members of the president's family. Just take a look at a headline from the Washington Post today. It reads, quote, "Trump's sons invest heavily in defense tech as father's administration pours money in," unquote. So on top of a bloated Pentagon, we now have this very real issue of self-dealing. Madam President, the reality is that bloated Defense Department budget is not going to make us any safer. It will enrich private corporate interests while deepening our budget deficits. At the same time, it's going to deliver a blank check for Donald Trump's illegal war in the Middle East. And I have said again and again, I will not vote to provide one dime for that illegal war in Iran. Granting this request for this huge increase would be a de facto authorization of this reckless war. Our colleagues have refused to have an up or down vote on an authorization to use military force in Iran. We haven't had that vote, but if we vote in favor of these trillions of dollars for the Defense Department, in my view, that's a de facto authorization, a de facto green light for this war, and I will not support it. Over 4 months ago, President Trump, together with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, launched this war against Iran. President Trump did so without congressional authorization, and the American people have already paid too high a price for this disaster. And this from a president who said he was going to keep us out of wars, said he was going to focus on lowering costs right here at home. As we can see, he's done the opposite. Started a war, prices are going up. And this is a war that has already cost the lives of 14 American service members. Hundreds more have been wounded. An American Tomahawk missile strike killed more than 150 Iranians in Minab, most of them children. And months later, while the U.S. military's investigation has reportedly been completed, it has not been released to the public, leaving questions about that strike unanswered, even as we consider legislation to provide trillions of dollars more to the Defense Department. On top of those killings of school kids, thousands of other civilians have been killed and injured across Iran and the region. Thousands more have been killed in Lebanon. 30 civilians have been killed in Israel. All these lives lost, and for what? Estimates show that this war has already cost the American people, consumers and taxpayers, about $132 billion. And the amount is growing by the day. It's a strategic blunder of huge proportions. And then we thought we were finally on the way to ending this war when the MOU between the United States and Iran was signed in June. At that time, I said on this floor that I wanted peace to prevail, and I hoped that the deal would become the foundation for a broader diplomatic settlement. That's looking less and less likely by the day, as the U.S. and Iran continue to ramp up the tempo of strikes. And now, President Trump says the United States will take control of the Strait of Hormuz, reimpose the blockade on Iran, and charge a 20% toll on shipping. CENTCOM said in a statement over the weekend that they struck 140 targets in Iran on Saturday alone. Iran has said the strait is closed and continues to attack ships. Everything points to renewed war, a war that was a disaster from the start. Madam President, I hope that President Trump would have learned something from this needless tragedy, that military adventurism, the promises of quick victory, the fantasies of regime change, and the endless effort to undermine diplomacy led us directly to this disaster. But apparently he has not learned from those mistakes. But we, the United States Senate, we should not add more fuel to those mistakes with this defense authorization bill. When you've dug yourself into a hole, the first thing you should do is stop digging. Beyond Iran, this bill also has no guardrails on the Trump administration's overreach on war-making and warmongering anywhere else in the world. It does nothing to restrain the strikes in the Caribbean that have murdered people on the high seas, or the grabbing of Venezuelan oil, or any adventure the president may dream about in Greenland, or the ongoing humanitarian disaster being visited on the people of Cuba. It does nothing to constrain the president in those areas. Nothing to prevent the use of those monies that are authorized for any of those purposes or anything else. Madam President, when Congress fails to exercise its constitutional responsibility, we leave the American people with wars that are easy to start, difficult to end, and driven by agendas that may not serve our national interests. It was just a few weeks into the Iran war that Prime Minister Netanyahu said, and I quote, "We are also bringing to this campaign the assistance to the United States, my friend, U.S. President Donald Trump, and the U.S. military. This coalition of forces allows us to do what I have yearned to do for 40 years, said Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. Yep, for 40 years, 4 decades, Benjamin Netanyahu has wanted this war. And he finally found an American president who was stupid enough and reckless enough to do it with him. That broader context is important when considering some of the new provisions in this NDAA that I mentioned earlier. They don't exist in isolation. They don't exist in a vacuum. They are part of the same pattern, one that would further tie the United States to the agenda of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the government of Israel at precisely the moment that Congress should be reclaiming its constitutional role, not surrendering more of it. The first provision, Section 1217, would mandate the creation of a United States-Israel Defense Technology Cooperation Initiative. This would require, the expansion and acceleration of the U.S. Israel defense relationship, including technology sharing, co-production of weapon systems, and bilateral research and development across sensitive domains like biotechnology, autonomous systems, artificial intelligence, and cyber warfare. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has openly stated that this initiative, it was his idea. In a letter to Congresswoman Stutzman, who led a resolution calling for a similar effort to Section 1217 in the House, Prime Minister Netanyahu wrote, and I quote, "I was glad to receive your proposed congressional resolution endorsing my plan to shift the framework of U.S.-Israel defense cooperation from aid to partnership." That's the way he put it. Just this weekend, Prime Minister Netanyahu acknowledged on Fox News that this was about merging and meshing Israel's military procurement with that of the United States. Again, he said, yeah, I'm calling it from aid to partnership. Madam President, if the United States and Israel were to sign additional co-production and technology sharing agreements as envisioned by this provision, they would threaten U.S. national security interests by handing the Netanyahu government leverage over American weapon systems and military technology. And this is not a hypothetical statement. The Netanyahu government has already leveraged its existing co-production agreement with the United States on missile defense to block American Iron Dome batteries paid for 100% by U.S. taxpayers from reaching Ukraine, directly against our own national security interests. In fact, in late June 2023, Senator Lindsey Graham and I sent a letter to the chair and ranking member of the Armed Services Committee asking that this issue be addressed and that Israel work with the United States to assist Ukraine, specifically referencing the American Iron Dome batteries we would have liked to transfer to Ukraine. In fact, the Ukrainian government had specifically asked for the Iron Dome system to help with its air defenses. They were not asking for Israel to send its Iron Dome batteries. We were talking about Iron Dome batteries in the United States, co-produced between the United States and Israel. And they were ready to go. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to introduce the one-page letter Senator Graham and I sent to Chairman Reid and Ranking Member Wicker in June 2023.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. What you will see is at the end of the day, the government of Israel, the Netanyahu government, exercised its veto authority under the co-production agreement, preventing the United States from sending our own Iron Dome batteries to Ukraine to help Ukraine with its air defense system. And now in this NDAA bill that we're about to consider in the United States Senate, there's a provision requiring the United States government to do more co-production arrangements with the Netanyahu government and the future governments of Israel? Give me a break. The second provision that I mentioned earlier, Section 622 of the Fiscal Year 27 Intelligence Authorization Act, mandates, and I say mandates, that the United States government, the executive branch, quote, expand and enhance intelligence sharing with the government of Israel, end quote. It also states that intelligence sharing with Israel, quote, shall not be suspended, reduced, or otherwise materially limited, unquote. The intent of this provision is clear: to not only enhance intelligence sharing with Israel, but also to block the president from limiting such intelligence sharing. Now, colleagues, anytime the United States government wants to or chooses to, of course we can share intelligence with the government of Israel or any other government we choose for our own interests. Why would we hardwire into the law a requirement that that intelligence be shared with Israel or any other country? And there's a peculiar procedural wrinkle here I want to mention. This provision isn't in the text of the NDAA yet. As I said, it sits in the Fiscal Year Intelligence Authorization Act that passed the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. But as my colleagues know, that bill typically gets added to the NDAA right here on the floor of the Senate before final passage, meaning that the Senate may be asked to adopt this provision that hardwires and requires U.S. intelligence sharing with the government of Israel with no real debate. And that should concern us all, especially since, according to public reports, this administration recently raised the counterintelligence threat level from the government of Israel to its highest level. At the same time, this Senate is talking about adopting a provision mandating intelligence sharing. As I said, any president can share intelligence at their discretion. But this requires it, and we should not be forcing this administration or any other administration to share U.S. intelligence with the government of Israel or any other government for that matter. This is also happening, as I said, at a time when we're seeing accelerated violence and expansion of settlements on the West Bank. We've heard outrageous statements from Finance Minister Smotrich and from Ben-Gvir, who controls many of Israel's security forces. It's simply not in our interests to mandate that the United States government enter into co-production agreements with the Netanyahu government or any government of Israel. You can always do this on a case-by-case basis, as we did with the Iron Dome, and not require by law that we do it in a whole range of other areas. And as I said, this bill also comes before us with a huge proposed increase in funds for the Pentagon, which continues to fail to pass a budget audit, and at a time when it appears that the President of the United States is again ramping up the war against Iran, an unauthorized war. And so I urge my colleagues that when we consider the motion to proceed tomorrow, specifically the motion for cloture on the motion to proceed, the vote on the cloture for the motion to proceed, that we oppose that and then come together as senators and say to the American people, we're going to ensure accountability. We're going to ensure that when that bill comes to the floor of the Senate, we will have votes on all of these issues. We'll have a vote to bring down the huge bloated number for military spending in the NDAA. We'll have a vote to require some accountability with respect to military operations. And we'll have a vote with respect to these new provisions that currently mandate intelligence sharing and mandate defense procurement cooperation with the Netanyahu government and future governments of Israel. I hope we will show the American people that we believe in transparency and accountability by having those votes, but to do so, we have to first vote against motion, the cloture motion on the motion to proceed. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. I yield my remainder time to my friend and colleague, the Senator from Vermont, Senator Welch.
President.
Senator from Vermont.
I thank my colleague, Senator from Maryland, for leading this discussion on what is an absolutely critical decision that this